Welcome to the Christian Business Concepts with your host, Harold Milby. Christian Business Concepts is dedicated to guiding companies and business owners in becoming effective, efficient, and successful through God's Word and godly principles. Now, here's your host, Harold Milby.
Thanks, Kelly, and welcome everyone to this week's Christian Business Concepts podcast. I'm your host, Harold Milby, and I'm so glad that you have decided to download and listen to this episode. You know, our goal here every week is to help Christian business leaders and owners, managers, and organizations find true godly success through biblical principles. You know, the Bible has a lot to say about business and leadership, and it's the real reason that we find true godly success is through His Word. And I pray for each of you today, and I pray that each of you will be encouraged, that you'll be enlightened, and that you'll be empowered by what you hear in this podcast today, and that you'd be willing to help grow the community by sharing it with 4 or 5 other people, and that you'd even be willing to post it on your Facebook and on your LinkedIn pages. That's how we grow the Christian Business Concepts family. Now, before we get into today's podcast, I just want to give a big shout out, like I always try to do, but I want to give a big shout out to Stockholm, Sweden for downloading so many podcasts this week. We love you guys. We appreciate you. And thanks to all of you around the world for helping grow the CBC community. Couldn't do it without you. I'm so glad that we're able to help, and I believe there's many others that can also use the help of biblical principles in their business. So today, I want to talk about the importance of having healthy boundaries as a business leader, as an owner, as a manager, or just as a person. You know, as our kids were growing up, we taught our kids the purpose of healthy boundaries in their life, and how to have them, and how to respect the boundaries in somebody else's life. You know, we also explained that if someone did not respect their boundaries, that they shouldn't be around that person. You know, it's about having respect for yourself as a person. Now, that's also important for today's business leader. You know, having business boundaries shows you have respect for your leadership and for the business you own or run, and even for the department that you lead. You know, according to Oxford Dictionary, the definition for the word boundary is a line that marks the limits of an area, a dividing line, or a limit of a subject or sphere of activity. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about boundaries. We're talking about a line that marks the limits in certain areas. Establishing these boundaries in your professional life is like drawing lines in the sand, you know, that you're not going to allow other people to cross, including you're not going to allow yourself to cross over those boundaries as well. See, boundaries protect the person who has them, but it also protects other people on the other side of those lines. So we're going to look at today the importance of having business boundaries, the positive effects of having these boundaries in the areas in which we need them, and the biblical principles that support them. So, you know, Edwin Lewis Cole said one time, he said, boundaries are to protect life, not to limit pleasures. So please understand, I'm not trying to take away the joy and the excitement and the enjoyment of doing your work or being in business. I'm just saying that you need to have boundaries to help protect your life. You know, 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and 14, it says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? You know, this passage is talking about boundaries. It's talking about boundaries. In 1 Corinthians 6 and 12, it says, all things are lawful for me. This is Paul speaking. He says, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Again, he is stressing having boundaries in his life. Now, I also have to let you know that just as there are healthy boundaries, there are unhealthy boundaries. And these unhealthy boundaries can lead to things like stress and burnout, strained relationships, decreased effectiveness. But today, let's talk about some examples of unhealthy boundaries. So one would be overworking. Working long hours, no breaks, no time off. It can lead to burnout or decreased productivity. It can have negative impacts on a person's physical life, mental life. It can lead to depression. Another is micromanaging, being overly involved in every detail and every decision-making process. That can create a lack of trust, and it limits your team, limits your people from being effective. And then there's that blurred line between work and personal life. This can lead to having the difficulties disconnecting, from work. You bring your work home. Even when you are home, you're not really there. You have a decreased focus on personal relationships and just a poor work-life balance. Another would be ignoring your personal well-being. In other words, your own physical body. You just work until you can't work anymore. And I have to be honest, those last two, the blurred lines between work and professional life and ignoring personal well-being, those were two things that back in my 40s, even into my 50s, I was guilty of. And so much so that it put such a strain on my marriage that my marriage almost failed over it. So it's very important to understand how those negative boundaries can affect us and those that we love. So then we can have a lack of boundaries with technology. You can be a slave to your email, your text messages, and notifications. They can just be really distracting. They can make it difficult to engage in a person's personal or professional interactions. Now, these are just a few of the unhealthy boundaries that I've seen with leaders in businesses and organizations. And if you truly care about yourself and your business or your department or organization, you're going to establish good, healthy business boundaries. Luke 5 and 15 to 16 says, "But now, even more, the report about him went abroad, and great crowds gathered to hear him and to be healed of their infirmities. But he would withdraw to desolate places and pray." Jesus would not allow the religious leaders of the time to bait him into answering questions that would make him look foolish. He also took time out. As we just read that passage, he said, there were great crowds that followed him everywhere, and they wanted to be healed, but he withdrew himself to desolate places and prayed, the Bible said. And so we understand that he had boundaries. He had absolute boundaries, and here's another example, Matthew 16, verses 22 and 23. It says, "And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, 'Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you,'" because he had just told his disciples that, he was going to be delivered up and he was going to be crucified. Then in verse 23, Jesus turns to Peter, it says, and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." So again, Jesus had these boundaries that he just wasn't going to allow people to cross. He was going to protect himself with these boundaries. And so, I wish I had a lot more time to share a lot of the scriptures that shows how Jesus had healthy boundaries, but there's just not enough time today. But let me tell you, there is a lot of passages, a lot of scripture that shows that Jesus had these healthy boundaries. And it's important for us to do so as well. So there are plenty of examples of leaders with no boundaries or unhealthy boundaries in today's headlines. I mean, you think about Harvey Weinstein, Travis Kalanick. He had such an unhealthy boundary, or he had such unhealthy boundaries, and just a lack of respect for other people's boundaries that he really created a very toxic work culture at Uber. So, these are modern people today that showed that they just had poor boundaries. So Healthy boundaries, on the other hand, they're there for your protection. It protects your time, it protects your energy, it protects your resources, and it protects your personal life. I mean, what would happen if there were no property boundaries in your neighborhood? Think about that. If you didn't have any property boundaries in your neighborhood, it'd just become chaos. It'd be confusion. I believe eventually it'd lead to violence. So let me say this. If you have not established clear boundaries in your professional life up until now, there's hope. But understand this, when you begin to establish those boundaries, you're going to upset some people around you because they've been used to you not having any boundaries. Now, don't let those opinions keep you from implementing those boundaries. I don't care if it's one or a lot of them, but you don't let those comments, don't let those people hinder you and stop you from creating those. So some of the reasons that we don't establish boundaries are that, number one, we don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. I don't want to offend anybody. Another is that we're afraid people won't like us if we have boundaries. A lot of business leaders, they struggle. They really struggle with wanting people to like them. Another is that we don't respect other people's boundaries. Why would we have boundaries if we don't respect other people's? And really for some businesses, people in leadership, they sometimes think it can cause a negative financial impact. So they don't have these boundaries. Richard Branson, who's the founder of the Virgin Group and Virgin Airlines, he's known for his very adventurous spirit, of course, his entrepreneurial success. But he also emphasized the value of work-life balance and personal well-being. He sets boundaries around his time. He prioritizes his family and encourages a culture of flexibility and creativity in his business. Another example of good boundaries is Warren Buffett of Berkshire Hathaway. And then Mary Barra, she's the CEO of GM. And then Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook. These are just a few of today's business leaders who have implemented these boundaries in their professional life. So let's look at the 7 boundary zones, what I would call the 7 important boundary zones that you need to consider for creating boundaries in your professional career. Number 1, time boundaries. Time is the most important tool that a leader has, and yet many of them do not understand the importance of controlling it. Stephen Covey said the key is in not spending time, but in investing it. So we don't want to just spend time, we want to invest in it. And to do that, you have to have time boundaries. So first thing you need to do is you need to define your work hours. What are they going to be? What's your work hours? As a business leader, there are some business leaders that can do more work in a 6-hour period than many others can do in a 16-hour period. So it's not about how much time you spend at work, it's about how much you get done. And when you establish time boundaries, you begin to help yourself do that. So you need to limit your meetings, limit interruptions. I used to be really bad. When I pastored, I kept my door open to my secretary's office, and people would come by the offices, and I would allow myself to be interrupted many, many times until finally my secretary said, look, I'm going to keep your door closed. I think it'll help you, and it'll keep you from feeling like you have to get up every time you hear somebody walk in the door. And it did. It absolutely did help me, and it taught me a tremendous lesson. But you've got to limit meetings and interruptions. I worked for a company one time that had so many meetings. I don't know how they expected me or anybody else to get work done because I was always in a meeting. I'm talking about 4 or 5 meetings a day. I mean, it bordered on just absolutely ridiculous behavior. But we need to set these time boundaries. Even when you have meetings, when you do have meetings, set time limits. Here's how long the meeting's going to last. And then you clearly communicate those boundaries and you enforce those time boundaries. You've got to make sure that you do that. Galatians 6, 4, and 5, it says each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one should carry their own load. In other words, don't let somebody come in there, take up a lot of your time, and unload on you when what they're trying to get you to carry is what they should be carrying. So protect your time, have some time boundaries. The next thing is going to be workload boundaries. Are you doing more than you should? More importantly, are you doing doing things because you think you are the only person who can do them? That's a huge mistake. That is an absolute huge mistake. Because there are times when, yes, you can do something and you're going to do it better than anybody else, but that doesn't mean you have to do it. It means that you need to stretch some of your staff, stretch some of the people that work for you, stretch employees, teach them, help them to do it not as good as you do, help them to do it better than you do. But give them the opportunity. But just because you can do it better doesn't mean you need to be doing it. So you need to look at that. Warren Buffett said the difference between successful people and really successful people is that really successful people say no to almost everything. Wow, what a comment. So you need to make sure that you're honest with yourself as well about your capacity. How much can you do? Don't assume that everything is urgent. Don't assume that. Don't think everything's important, everything's urgent, because trust me, it's not. And then you need to be good at prioritizing your task and your projects. And then next, you need to delegate effectively. And then set realistic expectations. I always loved the book of Exodus in chapter 18, where that Moses' father-in-law is watching Moses after he leads the children of Israel out of Egypt. And Moses' father-in-law looks at him and just shakes his head. And finally, in verses 17 and 18 of Exodus 18, it says, And Moses' father-in-law said unto him, The thing that thou doest is not good. Thou wilt surely wear away both thou and this people that is with thee. For this thing is too heavy for thee. Thou art not able to perform it thyself alone. See, Moses was trying to do everything. His father-in-law saw it. He gave Moses some really good advice, and he taught him how to delegate, and it probably saved his life. Physically, emotionally, it was really, really good advice. And today, I use that a lot with pastors and business owners that I speak with and that I work with and that we do seminars with and that kind of thing. I talk about that. Next would be your work-life boundaries. How many families have been shattered, have been destroyed because there's no work-life balance? When it's all said and done, let me say this. When it's all said and done, when your kids are grown and have their own families, they're not going to remember how hard and how much you worked for them. They're going to remember how often you were there with them. Keep that in mind. 1 Timothy 5 and 8 says, But if any provide not for his own, and specifically for those of his own house, he has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. That's pretty strong language. For a person who doesn't take care of his own family, you've got to have a work-life boundary. Dolly Parton, the country singer, she said, never get so busy making a living that you forget to make a life. So what do? Well, you've got to prioritize that time for your family and for your friends. You need to block off time for your own personal activities, for hobbies or social connections, self-care, if you need to exercise or do what you need to do. And then you need to nourish your mind, nourish your body, your spirit. Have a annual growth plan, a personal growth plan. I've talked about this before, but you need to develop your own personal growth plan. And then you've got to make time for these things. Carve it out. And let me say this, People, I don't have time. I don't have time. I don't have time. Well, let me tell you something. You'll always make time for what's important to you. If your family's really important to you, then you'll make time for your family. So make sure that you have work-life boundaries. All right, number 4, self-care boundaries. We just talked a little bit about that. So how many times have we seen business leaders die before their time? How many become burnout? So there's burnout and then there's fizzle out. Well, what's the difference? Well, fizzle out means that you have these great leaders who shoot off like a rocket and they're successful. Their business is doing great. They're doing great. But because they don't take care of themselves, they fizzle out and then they crash and burn. And so you've got to prioritize that, and you have to set these boundaries. So you've got to begin to identify your spiritual, your physical, and your emotional needs and what you want. And then what you do is you make a self-care top priority list, and not make it an afterthought. It can't be an afterthought. It has to be a boundary. This is what I'm going to do. Here's the line in the sand. And then you've got to create good practices. And then learn stress management techniques. You need to learn that. Take some time, study it, and just learn it. Put a few hours into it and learn it. And then what you can do in your business or your organization is you create a culture that shows people that they should care about themselves physically and emotionally and spiritually. So you create this self-care culture. And then next, look for feedback. Ask your spouse, am I taking care of myself? And my spouse is quick to tell me when she doesn't feel like I'm taking care of myself like I should be. And that's just something we do for each other. I've done it with her. She's done it with me. All right, number 5, you need emotional boundaries. Emotional boundaries. And you think, well, what about emotional boundaries? Well, you need to reflect and identify on what triggers you emotionally. And then you need to establish some boundaries with those things. Look at your past experience. Where have your emotional boundaries been crossed? Reflect on that. Figure it out. Identify any kind of behaviors that challenge your emotional boundaries. And then what you need to do is you just have to develop strategies to overcome them. And that's something that you can do. But you need to have emotional boundaries. Next is communication boundaries. So communication boundaries, they are essential for maintaining your clarity, your professionalism, and respect in your interaction with other people. So you've got to establish communication boundaries. Well, one of those is establish technology boundaries. In other words, how often do you sit and look at your emails? How often are you on social media? How often are you checking statuses? Are you tied to your computer or your laptop? Are you constantly looking at your phone? Are you constantly on the phone? When you're with your family, do you put your phone down, or are you scrolling through stuff all the time and telling your family it's work related? Now, you can set exceptions, but you need to make sure that you establish these boundaries. You need to have boundaries on how you want to be communicated with, what you're going to allow, what you're not going to allow. I'm not going to allow somebody to talk to me like this. I'm not going to allow people to bring this type of information to me. What are the preferred channels? How do you want to be communicated with? What's the best way? Text? Is it emails? Is it an appointment? What is your preferred method, your preferred channel of communication? And then what about your response times? I've seen people that they get a text. I don't care where they're at, what they're doing, who they're talking to. They can't help themselves. They just immediately have to stop what they're doing and respond to the text. You don't have to do that. You're a slave to that if that's what you do. So what you need to do is just develop the proper response times. If you say, okay, if somebody texts me, I want to be able to text them back in 30 minutes. Great. That's a great boundary. Don't break it, unless it's an emergency, of course. And then what are maybe some of the levels of formality that you want? But you have to determine those things. And then you have to develop a communication cadence with people that work for you. In other words, how often, what ways, what information they're supposed to be bringing you, how long is that going to take? Those are the things that you have to develop, and I call that a communication cadence. What's your availability going to be? What's your privacy going to be like? How often are you going to have people communicate with you? And then what are those methods? So those are the things that you have to look at. You have to look at those boundaries. Now, after you've developed these boundaries, you've got to begin to communicate them with everybody. Now, I'm not telling you that you have to communicate them all at the same time. I probably would, but you do need to communicate them. I do it in writing, but you have to communicate it. And this is when you draw the line in the sand. And you let people know that you're committed to it. Let them know that you're committed to it. There's an unknown quote that says, you teach people how to respect you by deciding on what you will allow and what you won't. And I think that's important. So establishing boundaries is essential for business leaders to maintain personal well-being, to manage workloads effectively, to foster healthy relationships. And by setting clear boundaries in the areas that we've discussed here today, I believe that you can create a positive and very productive work environment for yourself and for your employees, for your teams. And remember that boundaries are not limitations, they're guidelines to ensure that everyone's needs and everyone's expectations are met. So embrace boundary setting, embrace it, and understand it to be a very key leadership skill. And you lead by example, and you create that culture of respect and balance and success in your company, in your organization, or in your department. Lord, thank you today, Lord, for helping each of us to establish healthy boundaries in our lives. Lord, it's important. And Lord, help us to see the importance of them. Help us to guard them. And Lord, I ask you to bless those right now today, Lord, who have listened to this podcast, and help them to find true godly success. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, thanks again for listening to today's podcast and for being a part of Christian Business Concepts. We really appreciate you. We appreciate your support. Be sure to email us. Be sure to click on the text link at the description or on the top of the description. You can text us your comments, text us information or just something you want to share. We don't see your phone number. We can't text you back. It's just a one-way conversation, so you don't have to worry about us collecting your phone numbers and sending out crazy texts all the time. We don't. It's made really for you and for you to communicate with us, so please do so. And don't forget to post it on your Facebook and your LinkedIn pages. Well, that's all the time we have for today, so always remember what I try to say every week, because I mean this, and that is Jesus is Lord, and He wants you blessed.
Thank you for tuning into this week's Christian Business Concepts podcast. Go to ChristianBusinessConcepts.com for more information and resources. Be sure to check out other podcasts that will help you take your business and your personal life to a whole new level of success.